brother invited us for dinner, but when my husband and I arrived, he told me to send hubby back. My brother invited us over for Thanksgiving dinner, but when my husband and I arrived, he told me to send my husband back home. He said, in no uncertain terms, that Nick does not belong in our family, because, according to him, he is just a dirty, illiterate cleaner. I was stunned. I could not believe the audacity of those words coming out of Brandon's mouth. Let me rewind a bit to give you some context. Earlier this week, my husband Nick and I attended Thanksgiving dinner at my brother Brandon's place. Brandon is 2 years older than me, and for most of our lives, we were close. We grew up sharing everything: inside jokes, late-night talks, even those silly sibling rivalries that now feel so trivial. He was my rock during tough times, and I was his sounding board whenever life threw challenges his way. But that bond, once so strong, started to crack about 4 years ago. That was when I, now a 28-year-old woman, began dating Nick, my now husband, who is 30. From the moment I introduced Nick to my family, Brandon made it clear he did not approve of him. It was not because Nick was a bad guy, far from it. Nick is kind, hardworking, and deeply caring, qualities that anyone with an ounce of decency would admire. But none of that mattered to Brandon. What mattered to him was that Nick came from a different kind of family, one that Brandon deemed unworthy. To Brandon, the fact that Nick's background did not align with the so-called standards of our family meant he was inferior. Nick was raised by a single mother who, despite incredible hardships, gave him everything she possibly could. After Nick's father walked out on her when she was pregnant, her family turned their backs on her, deeming her decision to keep the baby a disgrace. Yet she stood firm in her choice, raising Nick with nothing but sheer grit and determination. She worked tirelessly, juggling multiple jobs to provide for him, ensuring he grew up with a strong sense of values and resilience. And I find that kind of strength and sacrifice far more admirable than anything my brother or I have ever accomplished, cushioned as we were by our parents' privilege. Our parents are both successful lawyers, and we grew up with a comfortable, even luxurious life. But Brandon refuses to see the beauty in Nick's story. To him, Nick's struggles and the fact that he supports his now retired mother somehow make him less. Brandon's narrow view of the world has poisoned his ability to see the extraordinary man that Nick is. Over the years, Brandon has made countless snide remarks and backhanded comments toward Nick. Each time I confronted him, and each time he promised to change. But those promises were hollow. When Nick and I got engaged last year, Brandon was visibly unhappy. He barely congratulated us, and during our wedding 6 months ago, he acted distant and disinterested. Still, I held on to the hope that, eventually, he would come around. I thought hosting Thanksgiving at his house this year, a gesture that included inviting both Nick and me, might be his way of extending an olive branch. I could not have been more wrong. When we arrived at his house, Brandon greeted us at the door. At first, everything seemed fine, but then he dropped the bombshell. Nick was not welcome. He said it as if it were the most reasonable thing in the world, as if sending my husband home was a perfectly acceptable way to treat another human being. I stood there, frozen in disbelief, while Nick, ever the gentleman, kept his composure. Brandon went on to explain that, at the last minute, he and his wife decided they were going to keep Thanksgiving family only. The implication was clear. Nick, my husband, the man I chose to spend my life with, was not family in Brandon's eyes. I felt my stomach turn, anger and heartbreak mingling in a way that made it hard to speak. My husband looked at me and quietly said, "We can leave." But I could not just walk away without saying something. I asked Brandon why he had invited Nick in the first place if this was how he truly felt. His response was flippant. I thought I could tolerate it, but I changed my mind. That was it. That was the moment I knew our relationship as siblings would never recover. I told Brandon exactly what I thought of his behavior, how small and petty he had been, and how deeply disappointed I was in him. Then I took Nick's hand and we left. As we walked to the car, I felt an overwhelming mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and a deep sense of loss. My brother, the person I once trusted more than anyone, had shown me who he truly was, and it broke my heart. Nick, ever supportive, told me I did not have to apologize for Brandon's actions, but I could not shake the guilt. I felt ashamed that someone in my family could treat my husband, the love of my life, so cruelly. But I also knew, in that moment, that I was done trying to mend fences with Brandon. Some bridges are meant to burn. My in-laws were already invited to Thanksgiving dinner, but my brother decided to extend the invitation to his wife's extended family as well. His wife was pregnant, and apparently she wanted to see her relatives, especially since they lived out in the suburbs and rarely visited. They were making a big deal about this dinner, almost as if it was some grand reunion. The only issue? Most of my brother's in-laws, aside from his wife's parents, were the epitome of snobs. To give you some context, my sister-in-law is just as much of an elitist as my brother has become over the years. It's honestly baffling because her parents are perfectly lovely people. I couldn't understand where she picked up that snobbish attitude until I met the rest of her family at her cousin Brandon's wedding. Let me tell you, they're all the same. Born into wealth, business connections handed to them on a silver platter, and not a shred of humility in sight. They take immense pride in their status, as if they personally built the empires they inherited. Fast forward to Thanksgiving Day. Nick, my husband, and I arrived at my brother's house after making the long drive over. The moment we got there, Brandon, of all people, intercepted us at the door. He pulled me aside and flat out said it would be too embarrassing to introduce Nick to the rest of his wife's family. He suggested, no, he demanded, that Nick should just leave to avoid any awkward questions. Can you imagine? I was furious. I immediately started yelling at Brandon, not caring who overheard. He was doing this intentionally, trying to humiliate Nick, and I wasn't about to let it slide. I called him out on how calculated this move was. If he didn't want us there, he could have told us in advance. Instead, he let us make the effort to drive all the way over, only to insult Nick at the doorstep. I told him he was classless, knowing that would hit a nerve. And oh, it did. He flared up, red-faced, and spat back that he didn't want me there either. But he didn't stop there. He said I should leave with my dirty, illiterate cleaner husband. For context, Nick worked as a janitor at a local store during college to help pay off his student loans. He also took on several part-time jobs to save money. There's absolutely no shame in that. Nick is as educated as anyone else in the family. He just went to a decent but not prestigious college because we couldn't afford the fancy schools my brother and I attended. Brandon's comment wasn't just offensive, it was a lie. It was pure venom meant to degrade Nick and, by extension, me. When Brandon said that, I completely lost it. I started shouting at him non-stop, and Nick had to step in to stop me from getting physical. Yes, I was that mad. I wasn't ashamed of Nick, far from it. I was enraged that Brandon had the audacity to insult my husband like that, especially in front of me. By this point, the commotion had drawn attention, and my parents came out to see what was going on. They asked Nick to take me home, promising to handle it later. I can't lie, I was disappointed in their response. They didn't yell at Brandon or call him out, even though they must have known he'd said something vile to set me off. I felt like they were prioritizing saving face over standing up for me or Nick. Still, I left with Nick. On the drive home, I ranted to him for a good hour, getting everything off my chest. Nick, as always, was the calm in the storm, reassuring me that Brandon's opinion didn't matter. When we got home, I blocked Brandon on every platform. I was still seething, but I knew there was no point in wasting more energy on him. I couldn't change who he was or his toxic mindset, and I was tired of trying. It was better to cut ties and focus on people who actually cared about us. That said, I was also upset with my parents for not stepping in more forcefully. The next morning, my parents called me and asked me to come to my dad's office to sign some paperwork. They didn't explain much over the phone, which made me curious. I wasn't sure what the paperwork was about, but I agreed to go. I figured at the very least it would give me a chance to speak with them and address the elephant in the room, Brandon. When I arrived at my dad's office, I was surprised to find my mom already there. Both of them were sitting behind his large oak desk, looking unusually serious. The air in the room was heavy, almost suffocating, and it was clear that whatever they were about to discuss with me was significant. They didn't immediately explain anything, not to me and not to Nick, who had accompanied me. Instead, they slid a stack of paperwork across the desk and told me to read through it carefully. If I found it agreeable, they wanted me to sign it right then and there. I was a little taken aback by the abruptness of it all, but I followed their instructions. As I skimmed through the documents, the reality of what I was holding started to sink in. These were papers to initiate the transfer of ownership of my parents' law firm to me. At first, I thought I must have misunderstood. For years, it had always been assumed, no, practically guaranteed, that my older brother Brandon would inherit the firm when my parents retired. He had worked under my father for years, essentially being groomed for the role. It was the unspoken but universally understood plan. To be absolutely sure, I looked up from the papers and asked my dad directly if this was what it seemed. Was he truly intending to leave the firm to me? His response shocked me even further. He confirmed that, yes, this was the plan, and he was completely certain about it. His exact words were, "After what happened last night, I have no intention of leaving anything to Brandon." My mom nodded in agreement, and they both expressed their desire to make amends with me and Nick. This was their way of doing that, by entrusting me with the firm, a gesture I couldn't fully process in the moment. This was no small thing. While I had gone to law school and earned my degree, I had never truly stepped into the role of a lawyer. After practicing for just 1 year, I realized it wasn't for me. I felt stifled by the routine of it and craved something more creative. So, I left and started my own business, a bakery, of all things. It was a far cry from running a law firm, and I had been happily running my little bakery for the past 3 years. Nick, on the other hand, worked in a management position at his company, but he was not a lawyer either. Brandon, however, had fully committed to the legal profession. He had spent years working closely with our father, learning the ropes and preparing to take over. This decision was going to hit him like a freight train. I asked my parents if they were absolutely sure about this decision, knowing how monumental it was. They assured me that they were. Apparently, after the party last night, my parents had confronted Brandon and his wife about the argument that had taken place involving me, Nick, and Brandon. Instead of apologizing or showing any remorse, Brandon and his wife dismissed the situation entirely. They were shockingly casual about it, and they didn't even bother to hide their disdain for Nick. Worse, they openly repeated some of the horrible things they had said about him, as if they truly believed they were justified. My parents were furious. They demanded that Brandon and his wife apologize to us, but they flat out refused. That was the final straw. My parents told me they could no longer trust Brandon and didn't want him to inherit the firm. They had come into the office early that morning, drawn up the paperwork in just 2 hours, thanks to an existing template they had originally created for Brandon, and were now offering the firm to me instead. Their reasoning was clear. They were nearing retirement and needed someone to take over, but after last night's incident, they couldn't see Brandon in that role anymore. Even though I wasn't a practicing lawyer, I was still their daughter, and leaving the firm to me meant it would stay in the family. They believed I was the better choice, despite my lack of interest in law. After reading through the documents, I stepped aside to talk with Nick privately. We both felt conflicted. On one hand, I was deeply hurt by Brandon's actions and the things he had said about Nick. A part of me wanted to accept the offer just to spite him. But on the other hand, I wasn't sure if this was the right path for me. I hadn't practiced law in years, and I wasn't even sure I wanted to go back to it. Eventually, after much discussion, Nick and I decided to sign the papers and start the process of transferring ownership to me. My parents were eager to celebrate the decision, but I couldn't share their enthusiasm. While I appreciated their gesture, I felt a lingering sense of discomfort. Was I making the right decision? Or was this all just a knee-jerk reaction to a family feud? Only time would tell. He, on the other hand, truly loved his job at the firm. It was his passion, his purpose, and something he had worked tirelessly for years to excel in. I knew this because he had always talked about how much he looked forward to one day taking over from our parents. It was his dream, and in many ways, he had prepared for it far longer than I ever did. That is why the idea of stepping into that role, a role he had envisioned for himself for so long, felt deeply unsettling to me. It almost felt like I was stealing something sacred from him, something that he had poured his heart into. But then, I thought about it again. I realized that I wasn't exactly stealing anything. Our parents had made this decision on their own. They had offered the role to me without hesitation, handing it to me on a silver platter. All I did was accept it. If they genuinely believed I was the better fit, who was I to argue? Even so, a nagging guilt lingered in the back of my mind, a sense of unease that I just couldn't shake off. So instead of celebrating or even embracing the decision, I went back home that evening feeling unsure, conflicted, and honestly, a little lost. After that day, I avoided talking to Brandon about it. It wasn't like I didn't want to discuss it with him, I just didn't know how to approach the conversation without making things worse. Then, yesterday, my parents called me again. They wanted me to officially return to work at the firm because, naturally, I needed to start preparing for the transition. They emphasized how important it was for me to ease into my new responsibilities. So, reluctantly, I went back. When I walked into the office yesterday, Brandon and I finally came face to face for the first time since everything had been decided. I could feel the tension in the air as my parents gathered everyone for an announcement. In front of the entire team, they proudly declared that I would be taking over the firm in a few months when they retired. The room fell into an awkward silence. I could tell that everyone was confused. For years, people had assumed that Brandon would take over. It was practically a given. Brandon stood there, frozen. He didn't say a word, but his expression said it all. He was hurt, frustrated, maybe even humiliated. I could see the disappointment in his eyes, but to his credit, he held it together. He didn't make a scene, which honestly surprised me. I thought he might explode right then and there. Instead, he walked away, clearly trying to process everything. Later that evening, I got a call from him. At first, I didn't recognize the number. It was from a burner phone, which was weird. When I picked up, he wasted no time. He went straight into it, accusing me of sabotaging him and intentionally taking away the role he had worked so hard for. He sounded furious, but underneath the anger, there was something else. Desperation. He told me he had had enough of this and demanded that I convince our parents to change their minds. The way he spoke to me was infuriating. His tone was so entitled, so bossy, as if he had the right to dictate what I should or shouldn't do. I told him point blank that I wasn't going to do anything of the sort. If our parents had chosen me, it wasn't my place to question their decision. Besides, it wasn't like I didn't deserve the role. I had my own qualifications, and I had earned their trust in my own way. Brandon didn't take that well. He started yelling at me, saying that what I was doing was unfair and unethical. He accused me of destroying his future out of spite, all because of some petty grudge. He even brought up Nick, saying that whatever he had said about him wasn't even untrue. That was the breaking point for me. I snapped. The conversation escalated into a full-blown shouting match. We hurled insults at each other, saying things we probably didn't mean but couldn't take back. It was ugly, and by the time he hung up, I was shaking. Before he ended the call, he said something that stuck with me. He told me that what I was doing to him was more disgusting and pathetic than anything he had ever done to me. I don't know why, but those words hit me hard. Even though I still believe I'm not in the wrong, I can't shake the guilt. I've talked to Nick about it multiple times, and he reassures me that I have nothing to feel bad about. My parents have said the same thing. They insist that they made the decision for the good of the firm and that I am the right person to lead it. But even with all that validation, I can't help but feel conflicted. When Brandon was yelling at me, I could hear the devastation in his voice. He's my brother, and despite everything, I don't want to ruin his life. I'm at a complete loss here. Am I the bad person for agreeing to take over the firm when it was clearly supposed to be his? Update 1. Looking back, I can see how I ignored certain signs about what made me truly happy. For instance, I've always loved baking. It wasn't just a casual hobby, I was genuinely good at it, and it brought me joy in a way that studying case law or drafting contracts never did. At the time, though, I never thought of baking as a viable career. It felt more like a fun side activity, not something I could dedicate my life to. Now, as I reflect on the choices I've made and where they've brought me, I feel so differently. The bakery business I've built over the past couple of years has become a source of fulfillment that I never knew I needed. That's what makes my current dilemma so challenging. If I take over the family law firm, I know I will have to give up my bakery. There is no realistic way I could manage both. It's not just about the time commitment, but also the mental and emotional energy it would take. The thought of walking away from something I've built from the ground up, something that represents my true passion, fills me with dread. And yet, the alternative, letting my brother Brandon inherit the law firm and effectively get away with everything he has done, feels equally unbearable. To be clear, my bakery isn't wildly successful in the traditional sense. It's not making millions, and it doesn't hold a candle to the financial success of my parents' firm. But success isn't just about money, is it? The bakery brings me happiness, and that's something you can't put a price on. The idea of giving it all up just to prove a point or settle a score with my brother seems, well, petty. It's not the kind of person I want to be. I've talked to Nick about all of this, how I feel torn between what I want for myself and what I feel obligated to do for my family. Nick has been incredibly supportive. He told me I don't have to take over the law firm if it's not what I want. He even suggested I sit down with my parents and have an honest conversation about how I feel. But that's where things get complicated. My parents have always been clear about one thing. They want the law firm to stay within the family. It's non-negotiable for them, and while I find their perspective outdated and nepotistic, I can't entirely fault them for wanting to keep their legacy intact. This leaves me with a frustratingly limited set of options. If I step back, the firm will inevitably go to Brandon, and that thought makes my blood boil. The dynamic between us has been strained for years, and any hope of reconciliation has long since faded. He has never apologized for the things he's done, and even if he did, I wouldn't believe it. It's not just that he hurt me, it's the complete lack of accountability or remorse that makes me so resentful. I can't stand the idea of him waltzing into this position of power and influence without ever facing the consequences of his actions. At the same time, I can recognize how petty this all sounds. The idea of taking over the firm just to spite Brandon feels just as small-minded as letting him win by default. I'm trapped in this cycle of conflicting emotions, anger, frustration, guilt, and I don't know how to break free from it. Nick keeps reminding me that it's normal to feel this way, given the circumstances. He's right. The relationship between Brandon and me has deteriorated to a point where there's no going back. It's like a house that's been burned to the ground. You can't rebuild something like that from ashes. The real challenge now is figuring out how to communicate all of this to my parents without coming across as selfish or vindictive. For now, I'm just sitting with my thoughts, trying to sort through the mess of it all. I know I need to make a decision soon, but the weight of it feels almost paralyzing. I don't know what the right answer is, but I do know this. Whatever choice I make, it has to be one that I can live with. Update 2. So, I finally did it. I ripped off the bandage and took the plunge. I finally made the decision to talk to my parents about everything I had been feeling for what seemed like an eternity. It's been 8 days since Thanksgiving, and I've had plenty of time to reflect on everything that transpired during and after that disastrous holiday gathering. Before things went any further, before my parents' expectations solidified into something unchangeable, I knew I had to summon every ounce of courage I had and come clean. I had to tell them the truth. I didn't want to take over the company. I knew the conversation was going to be rough. The decision had been brewing for weeks, ever since I signed off on the paperwork, a moment I now regret. But I couldn't keep avoiding the inevitable. So, last night, I invited them over for dinner. With Nick by my side for moral support, I laid it all out on the table. Exactly as I had feared, their initial reaction was harsh, but predictable. They were upset, frustrated, and confused. My dad's first words were sharp. "If you weren't sure about taking on the responsibility, why did you sign the papers in the first place?" That one hit hard because honestly, they weren't wrong. I did deserve the lecture about being indecisive. So I sat there and took it, silently nodding as they expressed their disappointment. Eventually, the conversation began to shift. My mom, always the more empathetic of the two, seemed to pick up on the genuine struggle I was experiencing. She suggested a compromise. I could oversee the company without being involved in the legal or day-to-day operations, but I had to be honest with them. I didn't want anything to do with the company. Not in any capacity. It wasn't just that I lacked interest. I found the entire thing mind-numbingly boring. I had tried to care, really, but it just wasn't for me. And I wanted to be transparent with my parents about that, even if it disappointed them. They weren't thrilled, but after some time, they seemed to grudgingly accept my decision. Then came the harder part, the part I had been dreading even more. I had to explain why I had accepted the role in the first place. I had to tell them that it wasn't because I wanted the position, but because I couldn't stand the idea of Brandon inheriting the company. That revelation landed like a thunderclap. My parents were shocked. They know me as someone who avoids conflict and rarely acts out of pettiness or spite. But I was brutally honest. I couldn't stand Brandon anymore. His behavior had been grating on my nerves for years, and the Thanksgiving fiasco was simply the final straw. I told them everything, how his insults about Nick had crossed a line, not just on Thanksgiving, but repeatedly over the years. I wasn't going to let someone like him, someone so arrogant and self-serving, take over the company. To my surprise, my parents actually understood where I was coming from. They admitted that it would look bad to ask Brandon to take over after the chaos he caused. They reminded me of how they had announced in front of everyone at the office that I would be taking over. Backtracking on that decision would not only damage their credibility, but also create a mess within the company. Still, they felt trapped. Keeping the company and the family was deeply important to them. But even if they wanted Brandon to take over, his behavior had been wildly unprofessional. After his outburst at Thanksgiving, he had ignored our parents for 3 days, leaving work in disarray. And when he finally showed up, my parents made the announcement that I would be taking over, which prompted him to stop showing up entirely. He hasn't resigned, but he hasn't been involved either. His relationship with our parents is strained, and there's no guarantee he'd even agree to take on the role if they asked him. I suggested they consider promoting someone from within the company, someone loyal, hardworking, and genuinely invested in the firm. They mentioned a few names, but I could tell they weren't ready to accept the idea of an outsider running the company they had built from scratch. I didn't push the topic too hard, knowing this wasn't something they could decide overnight. I feel terrible for putting my parents in this position. Signing those papers was a mistake, one I made in haste and without fully thinking it through. Now we're all dealing with the fallout. But at the same time, I feel a sense of relief. Brandon won't be getting away with his behavior. Not toward me, not toward Nick. He needs to face the consequences of his arrogance and cruelty. I know how much he valued his job, and I know losing it will hurt him deeply. But he brought this on himself. Even now, he hasn't apologized to me or Nick, and at this point, I don't even want his apology. It's too late for that. This isn't about revenge, it's about accountability. And finally, for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm doing what's right, for me, for Nick, and for my parents. Even if it's messy, it's the right thing to do. Update 3. It's been 2 weeks since my last update, and thankfully there's finally been some real progress. My parents have officially named a different successor for the firm. Let me tell you, it wasn't easy to get to this point. The new guy isn't family, something that would have been unthinkable a few months ago, but he's an incredibly diligent employee. He's been with the firm for years, practically growing into the role, and while he doesn't share our last name, he's almost like family. He knows the ins and outs of the business, understands its values, and most importantly, has the drive and interest to carry it forward. Honestly, I think it's the best decision they could have made. Convincing my parents to look beyond the family for a successor took a lot of time and effort. I had to explain the harsh reality. Just because someone is related to us doesn't mean they're the best fit to lead. I pointed out that there's no guarantee the firm would stay in the family forever anyway. I mean, what if their grandkids decide they don't want to become lawyers? Or worse, what if they're just not cut out for it? If that were to happen, the firm would inevitably have to pass into the hands of an outsider, someone they might not even know or trust. At least this way, they're making an informed decision now, while they still have control over the process. It's their choice, not an inevitability forced upon them. As for me, I've made peace with not being part of the firm's future. I was never really interested in taking over, and Brandon, well, he definitely doesn't deserve it. He's proven time and time again that he lacks the character and work ethic required for such a role. Giving the position to someone who actually wants it and has worked hard enough to earn it is the fairest thing to do. It took my parents a while to come around to this idea, but eventually they saw the logic in it. They've already spoken to the new successor, and the transition process is underway. Soon, all the paperwork will be finalized, and my name will be completely removed from anything related to the firm. It's a relief, to be honest. Brandon, on the other hand, took a different path, one that I can't say surprised me. A couple of days ago, he sent an email to our parents announcing his resignation. In true Brandon fashion, the email wasn't just a resignation, it was a declaration. He went on about how he's starting his own law firm, funded by his in-laws no less. He made sure to emphasize how ambitious his project is and threw in some dramatic line about how we're all going to regret the way we treated him. Honestly, the theatrics are exhausting. At this point, I can't even bring myself to care. If he wants to build his own empire, good for him. I'm just glad he's doing it far away from me. As for our sibling relationship, it's over. Whatever bond we had growing up has been completely severed. I've accepted that, and honestly, I don't think I have any interest in repairing it. It's sad, sure. There was a time when Brandon and I were inseparable. As kids, it felt like it was us against the world, but that version of Brandon doesn't exist anymore, and I've changed too. Nick is my priority now. He's the most important person in my life, and I won't tolerate anyone disrespecting or humiliating him, even if it's my own brother. Of course, there are moments when I feel a pang of regret. I think about how close Brandon and I used to be, and it hurts to see how far apart we've drifted. But then I remember how he's treated Nick, how cruel and dismissive he's been, and the hurt fades. It's clear that Brandon is no longer the little brother who used to look up to me, the one who was my best friend. He's chosen a different path, and so have I. My parents, thankfully, are content with the situation. They understand my decision, and Nick and I are happy together. That's all that matters to me. People might call me petty or vengeful, but I don't see it that way. At the end of the day, I'm just trying to be a good partner. If standing by Nick and cutting toxic people out of my life makes me the villain in someone else's story, so be it. I know I've done the right thing for myself and for the person I love, and that's enough. Brother invited us for dinner, but when we arrived, he told me to send my husband back. My family shunned me over false accusations. No apology came.